Good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Claire Regan, and I'm President-elect of the Society of Professional Journalists, or SPJ. We are 6,000 members strong. I want to thank the SPJ international community for inviting me to be a guest host for this important session tonight. But before we get into the discussion, there are a few housekeeping items. Please use the chat feature to let us know where you are from. The SPJ international community is dedicated to promoting press freedom globally and helping American journalists better understand the close links between global and local events. We try to bring together journalists from around the world to better understand the conditions and issues facing us all. These IC talks are conversations among journalists. Think of all of us sitting around a table after work, talking shop. Together, we can dig deeper into the issues affecting journalists and press freedom. We hope you take away information that will inspire you in your journalism work. Our program will be a conversation, and we invite you to be a part of it. Along the way, if you have a question for our guests, please use the Q&A function, and I'll try to get to it quickly. Dan Kabisky, co-chair of the international community and treasurer of the SPJ Washington, D.C. chapter, will help me keep an eye on the Q&A window. Please be sure to use only the Q&A function for our guests. And please, for the sake of our limited time of only 1 hour, keep your questions brief. Dan will be watching the chat window if anyone has questions about the international community or SPJ. This talk is being recorded and will be placed in our YouTube channel. Dan is posting the link to that channel now in the chat window. Dan is also posting the URL for the international community website, where you can sign up for the IC weekly newsletter that includes updates on IC programming. So let's get to it. First, a little context. Voice of America turns 80 this year. It began broadcasting in 1942 to combat Nazi propaganda with accurate and unbiased news and information. Today, it provides news and cultural programming through the internet, social media, radio, and television with a weekly global audience of more than 311 million. It's funded by the US government through the US Agency for Global Media. And yet many Americans are not familiar with the Voice of America. Its charter forbids it from broadcasting its news to an American audience. Before anyone thinks of the reporters and editors of VOA as just government hacks, keep in mind that these journalists work with the same ethics and dedication of any private news organization, such as the New York Times or CNN. VOA regularly receives excellence awards from respected groups such as SPJ and the National Press Club. We'll talk about how VOA has maintained its ethical and honest reporting despite several threats to its independence from different administrations. I'm proud to say that SPJ has regularly stood up for VOA journalists and for continued protection of its editorial independence. Joining us today is VOA's acting director, Yolanda Lopez, and Stephen Springer, the editor for standards and practices at VOA. Prior to her appointment as acting director, Yolanda served as director of the VOA News Center, overseeing all editorial and content production. She joined VOA in 2015 as Latin America Division Director. Under her leadership, the division experienced significant growth in audience by expanding media partnerships and affiliations. A native of Barcelona, Spain, she worked for the Spanish language television network Univision as news executive producer and executive producer. She was an on-air personality for the Telemundo network and is the recipient of 3 Emmy Awards. Welcome, Yolanda.
Thank you.
Steve has been a professional journalist and media executive for more than 4 decades. Before joining VOA, he worked for CNN for 23 years. During his tenure, he, along with many other CNN staffers, received a Peabody Award for CNN's coverage of Hurricane Katrina. He was also cited by the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences for CNN's coverage of 9/11. Most notably, he served as network pool producer for the US network's coverage of the 2004 Republican Convention in New York. Steve came to VOA in September 2008 as managing editor of the News Center. He has been the editor for news standards and best practices since September 2010. Welcome, Steve.
Good evening.
I should note that this is the first time these two leaders in Voice of America have consented to a sit-down discussion about the issues that threaten the organization's editorial independence. So we're making some news here today as well. Yolanda, Steve, thank you very much for being here tonight. Now let's get our conversation underway. I'll start with a question that's probably for Yolanda. Tell us what VOA's big story is today. What's standing out on your story list today, Yolanda?
Well, Ukraine obviously is the story, has been the story of the week. Obviously, in the latest in the last few days, we were also able last week to interview Secretary Blinken. We have a strong in VOA, a very robust, strong Ukrainian service and Russian service, which is helping us shape this coverage and this news. And we have recently appointed Miroslava Gottsade, which used to be our Ukrainian VOA Ukrainian service chief, and now she's our East European chief, and she is now covering the story. She traveled to Kiev to interview Secretary Blinken, and she is set to return to Ukraine to following the story. So basically, Ukraine is really the biggest story for us because of what it means for our target regions and what it means in terms of American policies and connecting the dots between all of this, what is going on in the region, what is going on in the United States as well, which is one of the things that VOA has to do.
Excellent. Well, that is a big story for sure. I'm glad it's at the top of the list. Maybe you could also tell us a little bit about the VOA workforce. How many employees in VOA and how many languages do VOA employees or VOA journalists serve?
Yeah, well, we have around 1,000 full-time employees, more than 500 PSCs, which is personal service contractors. And we have stringers all over the world. So we have hundreds of stringers. We broadcast, or we have 47 language services. That means, it's some of you that are participating in today's discussion know how hard it is to manage a newsroom. Imagine a news organization with 47 newsrooms. Each language service has its own, most of them, they have radio, TV, and also digital platforms. So the amount of content that we produce every single day is just incredible. VOA our workforce is very, very diverse, obviously. And when you walk through the building, into the building, and you really go to all around the world in just the building. You go to the Africa division, you go to South Central Asia division, and you always are hearing different languages, and it's very fascinating, really. Right now, there is not that many people going to the building, obviously, because of the pandemic, but it's just an amazing experience. It's like the United Nations in just one building. And we have bureaus around the world and stringers around the world.
How do you communicate with each other with all the different languages when you are in the same building or on Slack or wherever you're communicating? How do you do that?
Right now, we use Teams, and the language that we use to communicate and to share information and to share content is English. And we are using Teams now to have all the meetings, to share our stories and the story budgets and all the sharing that we do, and the conversations and the meetings are all through Teams. From time to time, I mean, there is some people really in VOA that is going to the building every single day. Like any other news organization, especially if you are doing broadcasting, it's very difficult for some positions to be done remotely. So we do have people, dedicated professionals that are going to the building every single day.
And just another logistics question, maybe I'll direct it to Steve. So VOA is headquartered in Washington, D.C., obviously. Where is the building, Steve? How close to the White House, for example?
We're about a good mile away from the White House, I guess, but we are about 3.5 blocks away from Capitol Hill. So that we're in Southwest Washington
Mhm.
and walking distance to the Capitol. So that makes it really easy for language services that want to go up to the Hill to try and find people in Congress, people from the Senate who they can talk to. We have live shot positions there for television on both sides, the House and Senate sides. So that makes it very, very convenient for us. We have reporters based full-time at the Pentagon, at the White House, and at State Department. Again, like Yolanda was saying, not everybody is working on location these days. Some people are rotating so that they're not always in the same place together during the pandemic. But it's still, DC is still fairly easy to get around when you're based in Washington. And so being in that part of town, it makes it pretty easy for us to get around to where we need to be.
And just a quick follow-up question about location. I'm zooming in from New York City tonight. So I do know that originally VOA was headquartered in New York. Is that correct? Either of you?
Yes, that is correct. When VOA started, it was based in New York. I believe it moved to Washington either in the late 40s or early 1950s. I don't know that for sure, but yes, New York was the original headquarters.
Interesting. And just one more history question, because it is the 80th anniversary of VOA, I believe, like just in the next week or so. Is that right, Yolanda? Is it next week?
Yeah, February 1st.
A week from today, actually.
Okay, very timely. What would either of you say has changed, or what has stayed the same? I mean, that's a big span of time, but maybe you could think of one thing about VOA that has stayed the same, and one thing that has changed drastically in 80 years.
Oh,
wow. I would say the distribution, because remembering that VOA was only on radio from its inception for decades. And I don't think VOA started doing TV until the early 90s. And when I got to VOA in September of 2008, the web was still a pretty basic, bare bones kind of website. And I would say in the 13 years that I've been here, the websites have become more robust. Obviously, we've branched out into social media, which obviously didn't exist for a long time. Our television production has improved in the time I've been here. When I got here, those of you who are joining tonight who know TV, we were only producing shows in standard definition. We didn't get to high def in our TV studios until about 4 years ago, maybe 5. And so now our TV productions look so much better than they did when I first joined. So I would say those are the major changes. What hasn't changed? Something that I think is really important for everyone to understand. And because the anniversary is next Tuesday, I've been doing a little bit of work on that, a little bit of research, I should say, on that. And the first words that were said on VOA on February 1st, 1942 were, "The news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth." As a lifelong journalist, I feel that's one thing that has not changed and should not change. That our job is to tell our audiences the truth, the good and the bad equally. So I see that as being a constant.
Excellent summary. Yolanda, did you want to add anything? Change? Same?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. What hasn't truth is the willingness to, what hasn't changed is the willingness to tell the truth. Another thing that it does have changed besides the distribution, and Steve Springer is very right to say that, is that I believe that in the beginning, most of the news were produced in English, and then the language services will translate the news in English. Right now, we put a lot of emphasis on the reporting from the ground, from the language services as well, right? So I think that one of the changes throughout the years is to give more importance and highlight more the journalists that come from other from our target areas, and the journalism produced and the great journalism produced in the language services.
Great, thank you to both of you. Let's talk a little bit about ownership of VOA, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners are interested in hearing about. So, VOA is government owned, but not government directed. So does this mean that VOA covers the news differently from large networks such as, CNN or BBC? What is the difference between those entities?
Well, the major difference is that our audience, we cater to an international audience. We don't cater to a domestic audience.
Not permitted to, correct? Not permitted to.
Yeah. We had a Smith month, and we cannot. And also we cater, we focus our audience is an international audience, basically in regions of the world where there is no press freedom. So we, first of all, we cover stories that most of the networks, some of the networks domestically do not cover. And because our audience are in places like, in some places, in Africa, in Latin America, South Central Asia, East Europe, and East Asia, we have to cater to their interest. So they are when we choose the stories, it is a very different planning meeting and editorial meeting that you may be having in a domestic news organization. And also we have to, we do a lot of explaining. So many things that we say in US media, we cannot say it the same way to our international audience. We cannot assume that some of the things that are said, or some of the facts, or some of the history or the context is already understood for our media, for our audience. So we spend a lot of time explaining and putting into context the news. So those are two major differences that you will look at. And if you go to our website in English or in any other language, you will see that our homepage may look different, and our top stories are different from the ones here in the United States.
So if I could follow on from what Yolanda just said, in our morning editorial meeting yesterday, Ukraine was the main topic of conversation. And the head of our Latin America division asked whether or not a full-bodied explainer, backgrounder about how we got to this point regarding Ukraine could be done, and could it be shared with all the different language services. And her point was well taken, because even with us knowing that we have a different audience to cater to, there's a whole audience in Latin America who may not understand the ins and outs of what's going on and why it's going on. So to be able to sort of custom fit that kind of programming to make sure that we can do that for everybody, I think that's one major difference between us. A couple of other things that you said, Claire, that I'd like to comment on.
Sure.
Yes, we're a US government agency, and the BBC is a British government agency. In terms of ownership, you're paying my salary, you're paying us to do our coverage, you're paying, US taxpayers are basically paying for VOA to do its job. But it's the same thing in the UK. I think there's a misunderstanding to some degree that the government owns the BBC. But having lived in London and worked in London for a year, everyone who owns a television and receives live programming in the entire United Kingdom pays what's known as an annual license fee, essentially a tax. It's roughly about $215 a year right now. And that money goes directly to the BBC, separate from income tax and anything else. So taxpayers are also paying for the BBC. So they're not wholly owned by the government in that regard. You asked about CNN. As you noted, I worked there for 23 years. And I think the big difference is that even though CNN has CNN International, CNN's reporting is still being done primarily from a US point of view. And Yolanda stated it very well. We report the news from within that region, from within those countries, in a way that the people who are receiving that news in those countries can best understand it. So it's not necessarily a US-centric view of a particular conflict or a particular issue. And I think that's what sets us apart as well from, say, someone like CNN that does have a global reach.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to share. Thank you. I'm just curious. I'm imagining, as a long-time managing editor, mostly in print, editorial meetings, there must be 50 of them going on at the same time within VOA at all your different locations. Yolanda, do you check in? Do you zoom in to any of them? Or, what do you do to manage all of that?
Well, that is very difficult. There are 47 language services having their meetings, and some of them are in different times because they cater to their audience in different time zones. So, it will be the 9 o'clock meeting in one service is the 8 o'clock meeting in another service, or 6 o'clock in another one. So. But we have a meeting, an editorial meeting with all the directors that represent all the divisions or the regions, right? And that the meeting is every morning at 9:30. And sometimes I participate, but most of the times the managing editor from the news center is the one managing that meeting. And one of the things that it is fascinating, and having been myself, I work in other news organizations, the private news organizations. The good thing about in here is that you know about the news of the world, in just one meeting. You go to the Africa division that tell you about what is going on in that part of the region, of that part of the world, or you go to the Latin America division and we know there what is going on over there. But one of the things that also I wanted to add as an added value that and uniqueness that VOA provides is that we can make a local story in one of our regions that we cover. We can make it a broad story, and we can connect the dots and see similarities and trends from very unusual, countries that maybe are separated from miles away, but we can see a commonality in some issues, like, for instance, climate change, of human rights, of women's rights and press freedom, and you can see trends around the world, and that is something that is fascinating. And also, we have the luxury when we need an expert in any of the stories that are coming from another country. I'm pretty sure in other news organizations they have to call people and go to different places to find someone. And right now right now you cannot walk through the building to another division, but you can go to Teams and just go to call someone in the Africa division of the PNM, which is the Persian network, and just ask for an expert on a subject matter regarding the region. For instance, I'm just looking at something that we did recently. About a relationship, not a news stories about Ukraine and the plane that Iran shot down. And it was a collaboration between our Persian service and our Ukrainian service as well. So that's one of the things that we can do, that we can just talk to our co-workers, our fellow journalists, and just get reference, contacts, and background on any story around the world.
Sounds very well organized. Wow. Okay, moving along. I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A, and I think my next question will address some of their questions. So the owner, the VOA owner, is the American agency, U.S. Agency for Global Media, correct?
Right.
And, yeah. So, and I understand that there's a firewall that ensures editorial independence from the government. Is it possible to be fair and balanced when the President of the United States appoints the director of the agency that owns VOA? Is it, how, I'm really asking, how do you make that happen, and how do you work to make that happen? Either of you, once you gather your thoughts. I mean, maybe we could start by explaining to our audience about the firewall.
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
the editorial firewall, and I also want to emphasize that the firewall is not something that's unique to VOA. It does exist in private sector news organizations as well. In our case, it's that no US government official and no US government agency can dictate to VOA how we do our work, how we decide what stories to cover, who we interview, how we produce our stories, how we edit our stories, how we decide what to put on the web and what to put in our programming. They basically cannot interfere with our work. That's the basic precept of the firewall, that we do our work like any other reputable news organization does its work. That's it in a nutshell. If you want to get into
how do you carry it out? Yeah, I mean,
well,
how do you
the interesting thing about the firewall, and in most normal cases, because I do training on this with our staff, in most cases, the staff at large will not be aware that there might have been a firewall violation, because usually once something like that becomes known, it'll come to me, it'll come to Yolanda, and ultimately it may involve our general counsel's office. And the one thing that I tell everybody in VOA, if they think that there is a firewall violation, that they should not handle it themselves, because they need to do their assigned work for that day. And that there are people within the agency who are meant to deal with these things. And again, that's myself, most likely Yolanda, and again, the general counsel's office. So we try and make sure that we keep everybody protected from having to deal with it themselves.
Right. Would a good example of a firewall, attempted a firewall violation be a recent incident with the CDC during the pandemic? Is that something you'd want to give as an example that was handled? You know, I'm looking for a specific example of how you would, you know, call to attention the firewall and use that protection.
The CDC incident was an outgrowth and sort of a lead-in to other things that happened within USAGM and VOA in 2020. And I think we're going to get to that anyway, but let me just explain to you a real situation that has happened.
Please, yeah.
Regarding how the firewall works. A little over 3 years ago, our Korean service had an exclusive story about how one government was doing business with a country that had international sanctions imposed on it. And he had the story cold, and he had his sources publish the story, and the story was published on VOA Korean and VOA English. After the story was published, he was contacted by someone who said she was from the FBI and wanted to know more information than was in the published story. Now, again, like all news organizations, we do not release unaired or unpublished content unless that gets reviewed by the director and by the general counsel's office. That reporter had already taken training in firewall, and he did what he was supposed to do. He told his supervisor, his service chief, the head of the Korean service, who advised the VOA director at that time about that. And then she contacted the general counsel's office, and the general counsel's office then contacted their opposite numbers at the FBI, explained what the firewall is about, and explained that what's in the published story was all they needed to know. And then it was dropped. There was no follow-up from the FBI whatsoever. But the other thing to keep in mind about the firewall, at least in our case, the rest of the government doesn't know we have this thing called a firewall. So should something like that happen, as did in this case, we have to explain to the person who's getting in touch with us, if it's, again, from within the government, why we don't release unaired and unpublished content. So that's how it's supposed to work, and that's how it should work.
So that's a good transition point into my next question, which it looks like Courtney has asked something similar. So it's been widely reported, especially by NPR, that there were problems under the Trump administration. And would you care to comment about that, or if not that, how things are going now under the Biden administration?
Yolanda, you want me to go or you?
Yeah, well, I can just say that during the Trump administration for 3 years, we didn't have, not that I know of, at least it didn't come to me, and any problems or any issues. It was, I think, at the beginning of 2020, in April of 2020, when things started to be a little bit different. And yes, and they're under Michael Pack as the CEO of USAGM, we had some challenges and, let's say, some different ways on interpreting the firewall. Right now, we haven't had any issues, and so far we are just reporting the news as always independently. But maybe, Steve, wanna talk a little bit more?
It was, as Yolanda said, it was around April of 2020, and it actually started with a social media post that we put up. One of the news agencies that we subscribe to, Agence France Presse, had fed video of celebrations, nighttime fireworks in Wuhan, China, because the government or Wuhan itself was saying they've overcome COVID-19 and yay. And so we did that. Now, we posted that to our social media account with credit to AFP, which is something we're required to do. That was discovered by the then director of, I guess, social media for the White House, who took us to task on social media. From that point on, everything escalated. That's when the president started to notice us, as it were, and everything moved forward from that. And that's when Senate Foreign Relations finally got to considering the nomination of Michael Pack. And then, it moved out of committee to the full Senate, and the full Senate approved, so that by the beginning of June of 2020, by the second week of June of 2020, Mr. Pack was sworn in. So it was a process. And it really, what's ironic about it is that you mentioned the CDC report before, and Greta Van Susteren was specifically mentioned in that particular exchange, in that particular story. Greta was working for VOA, doing a once a week interview program. And she'd been doing it for a while. And she had actually interviewed President Trump twice, if not 3 times on location when he made overseas trips. So there was no issue there. But it was only after these other issues started escalating that, interestingly, that her name got mentioned about, don't talk to Greta or anyone else at VOA. So it was, as I say, it was sort of a progression in terms of how we got treated.
So following up on the firewall, one of our viewers, David, is asking a question to you, Steve. You were mentioned a lot in a lawsuit that several fired VOA officials filed last year. My feeling, this is David's feeling, is that the lawsuit's ruling is a landmark case for VOA because it established that VOA and USAGM, the owner, journalists are protected from government censorship in the same way that private journalists are. What is your view of that ruling, and how do you think it will impact VOA's firewall in the future?
Well, first of all, I know David. Hi, David. Good to hear from you. He's a former colleague at VOA. It was a very interesting time for me. Just to give background, and again, as David noticed, it was mentioned in the lawsuit, it's a matter of public record. After Mr. Pack was sworn in as CEO of USAGM, I was put on detail, which is government speak for I was put on temporary assignment as a special assistant to USAGM, but with no assigned duties. And I was told that I could not deal with any standards issues involving VOA for the entire 120 days that I was put on this detail. So I was essentially, in essence, VOA lost its firewall chief, if you want to put it into some sort of expression. And there was nothing I could do for that entire period. So by making all this public, by filing the lawsuit, and for the different courts to rule in favor of the plaintiffs was a major victory for us in terms of us doing our journalism the way it should be done. At the end of last year, I think it was October or November, the Government Accountability Office published a report about the events of 2020. And in that, it said that Congress should consider new legislation that more specifically addresses the issue of the firewall and editorial independence. I know from my own experience that the General Counsel's Office, the USAGM General Counsel's Office, has been working on this. What I don't know is where that stands at the moment. So the hope is that there will be new legislation with stronger language that will make it extremely clear that the firewall also means that outside of VOA, in other words, USAGM is not necessarily an editorial parent agency. It oversees us, but there are 5 of us, 5 networks that do the editorial work. And so part of this was also the fact that USAGM was trying to reach in and dictate to VOA how we cover the news. And Yolanda was much more directly involved in that than I was, because she was still director of the newsroom when all of that was going on. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, Yolanda, but you were right in the middle of all that.
Yeah, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, we were, but the fact is that and a proof that we continue doing our job regardless is that we were awarded by the National Press Club,
right,
with a very an award about press criticism for the coverage that we did on ourselves of what was going on in USAGM and in Voice of America. So that tells you that we obviously we struggled and it was stressful, but the news center continued doing their job, and the journalists were extremely professional on continuing covering the news, even though we were targeted, and even I was removed from that position for a few days as well. And other journalists were investigated. It wasn't easy. But the thing is that if you look at the kind of content, the coverage that we provided, especially because it was extremely stressful, because we not only were under that kind of scrutiny, but we were working remotely. The first year that we were working remotely, which was news, very new to everyone, it was an election year, which made it even more stressful and relevant. It was also the year of all the protests, the Black Lives Matter protest, and it was very stressful. But I think that if you take a look at the coverage that we did and the coverage that we provided to our audiences, we continue to be as fair and balanced and objective as we could. We have been rewarded because of that coverage. So I'm very glad that we did. I mean, right now we can say, oh, we got an award, but it was hard during the time. But I'm very proud of all the journalists. This all the merit goes to all the journalists in VOA. Because at the end of the day, some USAGM executives were removed, were fired. They were out of a job, and so
and for some journalists, the reality of maybe losing their jobs was real, and especially if you are in the middle of a pandemic and working remotely and you feel disconnected, it's difficult.
Yeah.
But again, if you take a look at the coverage that we provided, I think that we did very well under the circumstances and didn't have any effect on us.
Yeah, a lot of courage there and how you handled that. And Dan has posted in the chat links to your award, the announcements about your recent awards for that. So I'm going to move on to sort of another topic related, but another topic about with journalists all over the world working for VOA. How do they stay safe, or why don't we just start with which country is the most dangerous for a VOA journalist right now?
Oof. Oh my goodness, there are so many. As you know, we have evacuated from Afghanistan. Well, right now, let's see what happens with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Reporting in Iran, well, it's very difficult to report in Iran that you cannot report on inside Iran. But right now, it's also very difficult to report in Latin America, especially in Central America.
Mm-hmm.
As well.
So not just with threats or about press freedom, but also physically, right? You're talking about their physical safety.
Yeah, we have had to like 2-3 weeks ago, we got to pull some stringers out of Nicaragua.
Mm.
So, you know, I think that everybody that does international media and international news, I think that it's always the same. The usual suspects about the usual, countries. But yes, I mean, obviously right now, those are the hot spots. And it is difficult, but we try to have a protocol to try to help them as much as we can, and to advise them and to train them. And just, but it's just amazing. And if you have worked with journalists, it is amazing how journalists just want to go where the danger is, right?
It's a calling.
It's a calling. Exactly. And I remember this journalist, this correspondent, which is great. She's fantastic. She wanted to go to Syria in a time where, well, anyway, it was very, very dangerous and will continue to be very dangerous. And at the end of the day, and there was a pandemic, and she told me, Yolanda, if we don't tell the story, who is gonna tell that story? Mm-hmm. And so many of VOA journalists told me they were not happy with the fact that we couldn't travel during the pandemic because it wasn't safe. Mm-hmm. And they will be like, if we don't go there, if we don't tell the story from the ground, who is gonna tell it? So many stories are gonna be untold. So many things that are going on that no one is reporting them. And that is really the commitment that VOA journalists have, and it's very inspiring. Yeah, very inspiring.
Do VOA reporters face extra safety issues because they work for VOA, a government organization? Do you think the safety issue is more intense for them?
Well, they do their work anyway. I will say that bad actors will always have this narrative, because they work for VOA, they work for the government. The fellow journalists and people that know us know that that is not true. Mm-hmm. But bad actors could use it. But it hasn't really been the case, and probably they are not as in any more danger than any other journalist right now. Mm-hmm. But I think that so far I don't think that is the case.
You mentioned Afghanistan. If you're able to, can you tell us if VOA journalists are still there and are they safe? Are you able to tell us that?
Well, we have been getting people out. I just don't want to go into numbers or anything like that, but I'm happy to report that we have gotten a lot of people out. Good.
And does VOA ever collaborate with other organizations that have the same goals, like Committee to Protect Journalists? Do they come in and collaborate with you in different situations around the world that develop?
Yes, especially on safety and security issues. And in fact, we collaborate with these organizations, and also we collaborate with other news organizations that like the BBC or Deutsche Welle in Germany, in the issue of Afghanistan, because we were facing the same issues, the same challenges. We collaborated a lot, and that was the only silver lining of all of this is the amount of collaboration and sharing of information that we did, because we were all worried, and we were all looking for the same, working for the same purpose, the same objective, and it was to get our journalists safely out of there. And we wanted any journalist, whether it is from the BBC, from VOA, from the Deutsche Welle, from whatever, to provide information to help them. And that we on a daily basis, yeah.
Rebecca Aguilar is on the call, and she's the president of SPJ. I'm the president-elect, so we work together often. And she's asking, there's been a crackdown in Hong Kong by the Chinese government on freedom of the press. Is the VOA there and still broadcasting? She wants to know.
Well, we had to get the, I don't know if for right now we have so many stringers there. What we are doing is moving more of our operations to Taiwan to make sure that we can report on the region on a safely manner. But we used to have more people there in Hong Kong.
Okay, all right, thank you. We're running short on time, so I'm moving along. Is there one misperception about VOA that you would like to correct? And we could ask this for both of you. Maybe we'll start with Steve. Misperception that bothers you in your position that you hear often or would like to correct right now?
Yeah, and I think we've actually addressed it a few times, in the fact that we are still perceived as being a mouthpiece or a loudspeaker or a spokesperson for US policy, or that we're agents of the CIA.
Spies, yeah.
And that continues.
Wow.
It's frustrating. I mean, I can even tell you that when I knew I was joining VOA in 2008, I have an email group from my high school, from my graduating class, and I mentioned I was changing jobs. And someone said, "Oh yeah, I remember VOA from when I was backpacking across Europe in the 80s. It's a propaganda outlet." Now, I had to say, well, no, it's not. And this is in 2008. Someone who's my age, who went to high school with me, is saying that we're propaganda. And I had to respectfully say, sorry, you're wrong. Take a look at our website.
Yeah.
So I think that to me remains the biggest misconception, that that, like you said at the beginning, Claire, although we are part of the government, that we are perceived as being a mouthpiece for the government. And it's very important for everyone to understand that we are an independent agency.
Yeah.
We don't report to state. We are a standalone agency, period.
That sounds like assumptions. People make assumptions and then it becomes misinformation. Yolanda?
That is by far the thing that bothers me the most, what Steve just said. And I think that we have proven, again, I just invite everyone to always take a look at our content and let us know what you think. And regardless of the administration, right? I mean, when people ask me about, if it is a Republican administration, Democrat administration, anyway, we don't care about that. We really do not, and we should not care. We just do our job, and you just take a look at our content and talk to our journalists, and you will see that is not the truth. And especially the recent awards, and I'm so happy that they were able to see through that, and to recognize our journalists as with as we are independent, like any other journalist, and that we are funded by the government, but we are not controlled by the government by any means.
Yes. I think this conversation is helping make that clear and maybe clear up the misperceptions, I would hope. We just had another question following the question about China, that three journalists have been killed in Mexico in less than 2 weeks. Is the VOA there in Mexico?
So we don't have, we have stringers all over the world. We don't have a bureau in Mexico, but we have stringers all over the world. And the way that, especially in Latin America, we distribute our content is that we work with affiliates, with the local media there, and they take our content. And this works very well, and especially right now in the subject of press freedom, because that way we can report on things like that instead of having the local media report on those things. And this way, if it is a VOA journalist, we are not in any danger because we are not there. So we are able to report on very sensitive issues that, the local media cannot report, especially, again, regarding press freedom and the situation of the journalists because of drug dealers, drug trafficking, and all of that, which is what is going on over there. And so, and we are reporting, and we do have a bit, and we have an extraordinary press freedom editor. We have the bit of the press freedom in which we cover this kind of stories, and it is, and I really invite you to visit our page and that this coverage. Our superstar editor, Jessica Gerriat, and she supervises and she edits and she coordinates the stories in the press freedom bit. And she has been following what is going on in Mexico very closely. So we provide that kind of coverage and information. And we also provide training to our affiliates regarding also security and safety and cybersecurity and telling reporters to be safe. So they can continue doing their job. So our commitment, especially in Latin America, is huge regarding press freedom.
A question from Eric. Interesting question. Don't you think the name of the organization, Voice of America, encourages people to think propaganda? Is it time for a rebrand? And it has been called Voice of America for 80 years. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. What do you either of you think about that? Have you thought about it? Does it ever come up?
Not in the 13 years I've been here.
It just has now.
No, and I get it. I'm not trying to be flippant. I mean, it really hasn't come up for discussion.
It's part of the history, but
I mean, Eric, I guess I understand what you're saying, but rebrands are not easy. And when you've been known a certain way for 80 years, and hopefully, that we've built up a reputation over 80 years as the Voice of America, I think it would be difficult to all of a sudden reverse course and figure out another name. I can't see it. I mean, we were all kind of taken by surprise when our parent agency went from being called the Broadcasting Board of Governors to the U.S. Agency for Global Media. But in that case, Broadcasting Board of Governors meant nothing to the outside world. At least U.S. Agency for Global Media gives you a bit of an idea, of what the agency as a whole is about. So, that was one rebrand that worked, but I just don't know what else we would call us. Voice of the World, I don't think really has a ring to it. It's the only thing that's come immediately to mind.
Interesting thought, right? So we always ask this question sort of to wrap up our conversation at the end of these chats, and philosophical and eager to hear both of your viewpoints on it. What does press freedom mean to you? Maybe we'll start with Yolanda. Press freedom, Yolanda. Kind of a big question, right?
It's a big question. Press freedom is the ability to tell the stories, whatever and whoever is involved in the story, whenever the story happens, just truthfully and objectively. But it's just to be able. It is difficult for me to define it, but I do have an example that is very simple. I remember where I come from, as you know, in Spain, there was a dictatorship for 40 years. When I was little, that dictator died when I was very little. But I remember this saying of people, the old people saying, oh, you know, when we were listening to the news and like bad things happened, corruption, thieves, murders, things like that, and they will say, "Oh, this never happened with Franco," which was the name of the dictator.
Did you listen to VOA, by the way, growing
No,
up?
it wasn't in Spain.
Okay,
No,
okay.
it wasn't in Spain.
Okay.
But the thing is that, but the thing is, this thing that, it didn't, these things didn't happen. No, it did happen. It's just that you didn't know about it.
You didn't hear
because
about it,
people were not able, journalists were not able to tell the story.
Yeah.
So press freedom is the ability to tell the story, whatever story it is, whoever is involved in that story, right? So it's just so people know all the stories and make up their mind about whatever the situation is. So, but on a free manner and safely, obviously, and independently, and without the fear of retaliation or anything like that. So it's able, the ability to know about the stories and everything that is going on, and the ability to tell that story, and nothing is going to happen to you for telling it.
Simple but powerful explanation of press freedom. Excellent. Steve, how about you? Press freedom.
It goes back to what I said at the very beginning, the opening words of VOA: the news may be good or bad. We shall tell you the truth. Be fair to all sides in a story. Give your audience all the information it needs to make up its own mind about a particular story. We're not trying to force a point of view down anyone's throat, but let the audience have all the information they need to take in that story and then make a determination about what they want to believe about that particular topic or how they want to react to that particular topic. Tell the story, tell both sides, tell all sides, but make sure your audience is fully informed about that particular story. To me, that's press freedom.
That's great. Well, thank you for explaining that. I appreciate it. And our time is winding down. So I'm just a few last comments and some thank yous. Thank you, Yolanda and Steve, for an interesting discussion and fascinating look at VOA and why it's important to help protect its editorial independence. The next confirmed IC talk will be in March, when we'll look at the news coverage of Haiti and the impact that coverage has had on how the American people look at the situation there. More details will be in the IC newsletter. Dan is posting the link for the IC website. You can subscribe to the community's weekly newsletter, and I can testify that the newsletter is a quick and easy read that includes loads of great links to interesting stories, as well as updates on the community's activities. The international community, is still working to confirm its February events. I can't say much more about that other than the sessions will be interesting. And here's a hint. There is even talk of a happy hour online, an online happy hour party. Zoom teenies, anyone? I don't know. Again, many thanks to Yolanda and Steve of VOA and to all of you who tuned in tonight to join us for this excellent conversation about press freedom. Be careful and stay well, and good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.